The names took 41 minutes to read, and not one person in that chamber made a sound. I have sat in the Galactic Compact's neutral witness seat for 28 years. I have documented 6,000 sessions. I have never once failed to file a summary notation before the chamber lights went to standby. There were 183 names. They were human, most of them. Some had spent portions of 31 years inside a preparation they were told was important, with no end date given and no guarantee attached. They did not live to see the declaration fall. That is where this account begins. Not at the vote, not at the filing, at the names. My name is Yoral Fendes. I am a Velhari archivist observer, seconded to the Compact's neutral witness registry. My function is to document, not to interpret. I wrote my opening sentence this morning. Then I stopped. I recounted it silently. Then I wrote it again. I have not done that in 28 years of notation work, and I want the record to show that I noticed. No victory speech. No celebration. No one in that room made a sound. That is where I will begin. But to explain the names, I have to go back to the floor. And to explain the floor, I have to go further than that. Stay close. The part that explains the names comes next. The accord floor of the Vethun Grand Deliberative sits inside Pralul Station, at the gravitational center of the Compact's primary jurisdiction zone. The chamber is a long oval, tiered on 3 sides, with delegation platforms arranged on the floor level and observer galleries above. On paper, every delegation platform is identical. In practice, the Dominion's founding charter gave the Grand Convener's office the authority to set platform height for procedural order. The specification allows platforms to be raised or lowered up to 3 meters from standard floor level. The Terran Compact's platform has sat 2.3 meters below standard floor level for 11 years. This is legal. It has always been legal. The Dominion wrote the specification. On the morning I am describing, I arrived at the observer gallery at the standard interval and began my session prep. I laid out my notation folio, checked the stylus tip, and confirmed the session record was open. I had done this 6,000 times. I did it again. The chamber filled slowly. Several Dominion block delegations arrived together, which was normal. The Terran delegation arrived 7 minutes before the session opened, which was also normal, though I noted it. They were always exactly 7 minutes early. I had noted it before, each time, and filed it under routine behavioral observation. I had never thought about what it meant to be always exactly 7 minutes early to a room where your platform was 2.3 meters below the floor. That morning, I thought about it. I did not reach a conclusion before the session opened. Nessa Call took the Terran delegation's lead seat. I had seen her in that seat for 9 years. She put both hands flat on the table surface, palms down, fingers straight. She did not fold them. She did not clasp them. She did not gesture. I had recorded this posture notation in my files before and filed it under physical habit, no significance. On that morning, I recorded it again, both hands flat, left thumbnail visibly shorter than the right, filed at an angle that suggested repeated contact with a straight edge over a long period. I wrote this down. I did not know what to file it under. Her team settled behind her. Drell Ondas, the science lead, placed a small framed photograph face down on the table. He did this at every session I had ever observed him attending, and I had a notation entry for it going back 9 years. The photograph had never been turned face up during a session, not once, not in any of the 412 sessions I had attended while he was present. Sova Fenrath, listed as tactical support, arrived with a partially filled-out maintenance requisition form on a thin data slate. She added 1 line to it during the pre-session interval, then set it aside. She had never, in any session I had observed, submitted the form. Yeth Andrew, intelligence designation, unfolded a printed page of what appeared to be agricultural output data for a species whose trade routes had been suspended 8 years ago. The data was not current. The print date on the page, which I could read from my gallery position, was 4 years old. She held it with both hands and did not read it. Ren Caldas, listed as communications, was humming something under her breath as she sorted her materials. 4 bars. Something without a fixed melody, or at least not one I could place, and I have a reasonable working knowledge of human musical forms. It was not quite any one piece. It repeated when she moved from one task to the next. And then there was Bren Vassal. Bren Vassal was the Terran delegation's legal representative, and he had been in that role for the entire 9 years I had observed Nessa Call's team. He was a medium-built human, older than most of the team, with a habit of holding his materials against his side rather than carrying them in front. That morning he was carrying a single slim notebook with a cardboard cover. The cover was worn at the corners, soft rather than stiff, the way cardboard goes when it has been handled in the same way for years. The spine was cracked, not broken but cracked, at the point where the notebook would open if you held it in your left hand and turned pages with your right. I noted the crack. I noted the wear. I noted that the notebook was clearly near the end of its pages, the back cover bowing slightly outward from the pressure of the full sheets behind it. I did not note any of this as significant. I was simply being thorough. Grand Convener Uvrath Kel Dasson entered from the Dominion delegate corridor at the session mark. The Grand Convener stands 2.9 meters at full extension, though he rarely extends fully in session, a matter of space, or perhaps habit. He has 4 load-bearing mandibles along his lower jaw structure, which lock when he is processing contested data. His dorsal ridge runs the length of his spine and produces a bioluminescent output that varies with his internal state. In 31 years in the Grand Convener seat, no member of the Dominion has ever publicly acknowledged that this variation is visible or that it communicates anything. In the neutral witness literature, we document it as a physiological response with no assigned interpretive weight. On the morning in question, the ridge was at full brightness. I noted this. It was normal. He took the convener's seat. He had held that seat for 44 years. He had never stood from it during an active session, not once in 4 decades. I had this on record. He opened the session at the standard interval and began reading the enforcement confirmation for Declaration 7 Omega. I started a new notation entry, Administrative Session, Standard Enforcement Confirmation. I began filling in the secondary classification field. Declaration 7 Omega had been issued 14 months earlier. It classified humanity as a provisional species pending full review, suspended 34 trade routes serving human-controlled shipping lanes, and placed 11 human-occupied colonies under absorption protocol to be fully transferred to Dominion administration within 90 days. The Grand Convener read the enforcement timeline in full. It took 11 minutes. His voice was measured, each sentence arriving at a precise interval which I had long since identified as a dominant signal. It meant, I am not rushing. There is nothing here that requires rushing. When it was finished, he set down his materials and looked at the Terran delegation platform, 2.3 meters below. He had dismissed 2,847 Terran procedural objections from that position, each one countered within 6 hours. None of them had ever made it to a vote. The Terran delegation did not raise a procedural objection. I stopped writing. I went back through my session notes, then the notes from the prior 11 sessions. I could not find a single instance of a Terran delegation attending an enforcement confirmation and filing nothing. In 9 years of observation, every session had at least one motion. I wrote, anomaly, no motion filed, possible strategic reserve. I did not know what to do with this, so I added, see prior sessions for pattern baseline. Then I realized I had just written a note about my own note, which was a notation habit that only surfaced when I was uncertain how to classify something. I had not done that in 4 years. Nessa Call's right hand was still flat on the table. Her left hand had moved. She had reached into her coat pocket, taken out a small object, and set it on the edge of the table near her left thumb. I could see it from the gallery, palm-sized, brass-colored, a flat disc shape with a small knob on the right side and a narrow slot across the front through which a number wheel was visible. It had no display screen, no network indicator, no charge light. It was, as far as I could determine, a mechanical counter of some kind, and it was very old. The knob had been worn smooth on the right side where a finger would rest. She turned the knob once with her thumb without looking at it. She put it back in her pocket. I wrote, unknown object, analog, brass frame, wheel mechanism, single increment applied at 11:04 session time. I noted that she had not looked at it when she turned it. I did not know what the wheel read. I would not know until later. The operation that produced file 2848 had been running for 31 years with a staff of 7. Its entire budget was registered as cartographic survey maintenance. No Dominion audit had ever flagged it. I did not know that yet either. What I did know, watching from the gallery as the grand convener finished his confirmation and the session moved toward administrative close, was that something was wrong. Not wrong in a way I could name. Wrong in the way that a room feels when everyone in it knows something that has not been said yet, and the people who know it are very good at not looking like they know it. Nessa Call's hands were back on the table, both flat. She had not changed her posture once during the 11-minute reading. Her face gave me nothing. I added a line to my anomaly entry. Delegation appears prepared for a specific outcome. I underlined specific. I did not know what I meant by it. I left it in the record and moved on. The continuance office occupied a sub-level room in Lagos, on Earth, that had no sign on the door and a lease registered under an infrastructure calibration services company that had never calibrated anything. The room had 7 workstations, one wall with nothing on it, and a filing system that took up the entire left wall from floor to ceiling. The filing system was not digital, not networked, and not searchable by any external system. Every entry was physical. Every entry was cross-referenced by hand. Nessa Call had a rule about the wall with nothing on it. No photographs. Photographs, she had said once, make a room look like it is waiting for something to be over. This room was not waiting for something to be over. It was working. The operation had one mandate, unchanged across 31 years. Document every Galactic Compact procedural violation committed by the Durath Accord Dominion. File an objection for each one. Keep the record complete. Assume it will be dismissed. Keep it anyway. The first coordinator of the operation had not been Nessa Call. It had been a man named Aaron Voss, a boundary surveyor who had been reassigned to the Compact's diplomatic track 18 years before the operation began. He had started the filing system. He had written the first 216 objection files by hand, on physical paper, before the operation had the staff to work faster. He had not lived to see the 300. He had left the tide counter on the desk when he left for the last time, with a note attached that said only, "Keep counting." Nessa had found the tide counter on that desk on her first day as coordinator. She had turned the increment knob once, the way Voss's note had described, and added the next objection file to the record. She had been doing it every session since. She had never turned it without incrementing it. She had never incremented it without having a file to justify the count. Each number on that wheel corresponded to a specific document, a specific violation, a specific Dominion counterfiling that had dismissed the objection while confirming, in its own language, that the violation was real. Drell Ondas kept a photograph of his daughter taped to every workstation he had ever used in that room face down. She had been 6 years old when he joined the operation. She was 37 now and did not know what her father did for work, because his employment record listed him as a survey data analyst. He had turned the photograph face up once, years ago, after a filing that had felt like it might be the last. The session after, the Dominion had countered in 4 hours. He had turned it face down again, and had not touched it since. Sova Fenrath had started the maintenance requisition form on her second week with the operation. She had never explained it and no one had ever asked. She filled in 1 line per session. The form was for a piece of equipment that did not exist, requesting a repair that could not be scheduled, submitted to a department that had been restructured out of existence 12 years ago. The form was her way of marking time. She did not call it that. She did not call it anything. Yeth Andrew had a different method. She read, not for information, she had said once, because the information in the abstracts she carried was years out of date and completely irrelevant to the operation's actual work. She read because her hands needed something to do, and hands with something to do are hands that are not shaking. She had said this without embarrassment once, and then never said it again, and no one had brought it up. Ren Caldas hummed 4 bars of something that was almost a piece of music, repeated at task transitions. She had been humming it for so long that none of them could remember when she had started or what, if anything, the original piece had been. And Bryn Vassal had his notebook. He had bought it in a paper goods shop in Lagos on his first week with the operation, because he preferred to work by hand when developing arguments. The entries were in a personal shorthand that no one else in the office could read, which had alarmed Nessa until she understood that the notebook was not for the record. The record was on the wall in the filing system, fully legible. The notebook was for Vassal. It was how he thought. By the morning of the session, it was almost full. He had used the same one for 31 years. These were the 6 people who had spent 3 decades building a document that everyone in the Galactic Compact assumed would never matter. The operation had run on a budget small enough to stay invisible. It had staff small enough to move without notice. It had a mandate narrow enough to never attract a secondary audit. And it had a filing system that had grown, year by year, objection by objection, into something that the Dominion had been building alongside without knowing it, because every counterfiling the Dominion submitted, in the process of dismissing each objection, had confirmed in official compact language that the underlying violation was real. 2,847 times, the Dominion had said, "This objection is invalid." 2,847 times, they had also said, in the legal language required by their own counterfiling format, the event described occurred as stated. That was the record. That was what they had built. And on the morning of the session, with the tide counter wheel reading 2,848, Nessa Call had put it in her pocket and walked to the transit point without looking back at the wall. 3 weeks before the session, a relay anchorage called Toval Sarath received a freight manifest amendment that listed a 4-hour transit stop for a vessel carrying calibration equipment. The manifest was routine. It had been filed 14 months earlier as part of a standard freight adjustment, the kind that gets checked by a routing algorithm and approved without human review. Toval Sarath was a logistics waypoint used by 9 species for freight coordination. It sat technically outside primary compact jurisdiction, which meant it had no Dominion observer assignment, no session record requirement, and no surveillance obligation under the Compact's monitoring charter. The freight manifest did not mention this. It did not need to. Nessa arrived at Toval Sarath with Bryn Vassal and Yeth Andrew. The anchorage was running on maintenance lighting, the kind that stays on by schedule rather than by presence, amber-toned and low, meant to keep equipment from going cold rather than to help anyone see. There was no announcement of their arrival. No advance communication had been sent through any channel the Dominion monitored. The meeting had been arranged through the manifest amendment itself, via a freight routing protocol that Yeth Andrew had spent 4 years embedding in a series of otherwise unremarkable logistics filings. The first to arrive was a Velhari elder named Vorincel Andrath. She was 200 years old, which for Velhari placed her in the late active phase of a standard archival service span. Her integument was slate gray, her cranial structure elongated at the back in the way of the archivist caste, and she moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been in a lot of rooms and had learned that the people worth listening to were usually the quietest ones in them. She had come from the Velhari Margin outpost in Sector 9, where 7 volumes of Terran conflict history were held in her personal library. She had read all of them. Not recently. She had read them over the course of 40 years, the way a person reads something they intend to understand rather than simply finish. She accepted a cup of water from Yeth Andrew, held it with both hands, and did not drink from it. She looked at Nessa. She did not ask why humans endured what they endured. She had read enough history to stop asking that. What she asked instead was, how do you build a record that survives the people who built it? Nessa told her about the Lagos sublevel, the filing system, the physical paper, the cross-references, the mandate, the wall with nothing on it. She did not make it sound like anything other than what it was. A room and a system and a rule about photographs. Vorincel was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had been waiting, for a very long time, for a system that did not require trust as its foundation. Proof was something she understood. Trust required a prediction about the future, and she was old enough to have seen too many predictions fail. She signed. The other 8 delegations came to Toval Sarath in pairs and threes over the following hour. They came from 9 different species. Their biologies varied enough that the anchorage's climate system had been pre-adjusted in 4 different increments to keep everyone in a workable range. They did not know each other well. What they shared was narrower than friendship and older than alliance. They had each, at some point, had their contested votes classified as unresolved and set aside, without appeal, without review, without acknowledgement that the classification might ever change. It had happened to each of them at a different time, under a different grand convener, for a different procedural reason. The Dominion had not done it to hurt them. The Dominion had done it because they were small, and the small gets set aside, and no one expects the small to still be there when the count comes around again. They came to Toval Sarath because they had each received a number. The number was how many times their delegation had been classified as unresolved in open session. Bren Vassal had pulled the numbers from the compact's own founding records, each one cross-referenced to the session in which it had happened, the filing that had processed it, and the grand convener who had signed the classification. He had done this for each of the 9 species, one by one, over a period of 4 years, working from the same physical records the Dominion used and had access to. He had not shared the numbers in advance. He shared them at Toval Sarath in person, 1 per delegation, reading from the notebook. Each representative heard their number. None of them were surprised. Every one of them already knew. They had simply never expected anyone outside their own records to know it too. They came to Toval Sarath because they had each had the experience of being dismissed. They signed because they had proof that it had been documented. The record existed. The record was complete, and the record on that morning was about to be filed. Vassal read File 2848 aloud, in full, standing at the anchorage's freight coordination table under the amber maintenance lights. It took 22 minutes. The 9 representatives sat and listened without shifting in their seats. The only sounds were Vassal's voice and the station ventilation, which ran at a steady low hum that none of them acknowledged. The filing cited 1,104 specific violations of Galactic Compact founding statutes. Each one was cross-referenced against the Dominion's own counterfiling, which had dismissed the objection while confirming, in official language, that the event had occurred as described. When Vassal finished, he closed the notebook and said, "We used their paperwork." He said it once. He did not repeat it. Nessa thanked each representative by species designation, using the formal titles from the Compact's founding documentation. It was a Velhari courtesy, using the old forms when you are asking for something real. Vorincell noticed. She did not say so. The meeting closed. No record of it was filed under the meeting's actual purpose. The freight manifest listed the stop as a transit waypoint, duration 4 hours, cargo, calibration equipment. They came to Toval Sarath. They signed without argument. They left without a record. The morning of the session, Nessa Call stopped in the doorway of the continuance office for a moment before leaving. The room looked the way it always looked. 7 workstations, 1 blank wall, the filing system running from floor to ceiling on the left. She did not take a photograph of it because there were no photographs in that room. She reached into her coat pocket, took out the tide counter, and turned the increment knob once without looking at it. The wheel moved to 2,848. She put it back in her pocket and left. She did not look at the blank wall. The blank wall had never needed looking at. It was not an absence. It was a choice. On the transit to Pralul Station, nobody on the team said anything that was not logistical. Vassal confirmed the filing documentation was in order. Andrew confirmed the vote count numbers she had been tracking for 4 years against the Dominion's most recent published record, which had not been updated in 30 years. Fenrath confirmed session timing. Caldas confirmed the comms protocols. Ondas said nothing. He was looking at his hands. They arrived at the Accord floor 7 minutes before the session opened. Nessa took her seat. She put both hands flat on the table. She did not remove the tide counter from her pocket. Not yet. Bren Vassal set the notebook on the table in front of him and did not open it. He already knew what was in it. He had known for 31 years. "I was in the gallery above. I was filling in my session classification form, administrative, standard enforcement confirmation. I was halfway through the secondary field when the Grand Convener opened the session and began the enforcement confirmation for Declaration 7 Omega. The Terran platform was 2.3 meters below the floor. This was legal. It had always been legal. The Grand Convener read the full enforcement timeline. 34 trade routes suspended. 11 colonies in absorption protocol, 90 days remaining. Humanity classified as provisional. His voice arrived at measured intervals. There was nothing rushed about it. There was nothing in his posture or his ridge brightness that suggested this session would be anything other than what it appeared to be, a confirmation of a process already in motion. When he finished, he looked at the Terran delegation. He had looked at them this way before. He had dismissed their objections 2,847 times from this position, each time within 6 hours. Nessa Call raised a procedural motion. This was normal. Terran delegations had raised procedural motions at 2,847 previous sessions. The Grand Convener's dorsal ridge did not change. I wrote, procedural motion raised, Terran lead delegate. I started a new entry line for the expected counterfiling timeline. Bren Vassal stood up. He opened the notebook to the last filled page. He looked at it for one moment. Then he looked up at the chamber and began to read the co-signatory list for objection file 2848. He read for 6 minutes before the Grand Convener tried to stop him. That was the first thing I noted as irregular. Not that a Terran delegate had filed a co-signatory motion. That was standard procedure, available to any delegation under the Compact's founding charter. What was irregular was the timing. In 2,847 previous Terran procedural filings, the Grand Convener had raised his interruption within the first 40 seconds. I had the timestamps in my records. 40 seconds was the pattern. 40 seconds said, I have heard enough to dismiss this. 6 minutes said something else. 6 minutes said he was listening. 6 minutes said he was counting the names. I stopped writing mid-entry. My stylus was still touching the page, but I had stopped moving it. Vassal read steadily. He did not rush. He did not pause. His voice had the flat, even quality of someone reading a legal document they have already memorized, which is what he was doing. I understood this later, after I had reconstructed the scene from what I had witnessed and what the freight records told me about Toval Sarath. He had read this list aloud once before, in that amber-lit anchorage, to 9 representatives who had not interrupted him. He was reading it again now. The list was not long. 9 species, 9 formal designations, the old titles, the ones from the founding documentation that had not been used in active session for decades, because the species holding them had been classified as contested and therefore set aside. The Grand Convener raised his interruption flag at the 6-minute mark. Vassal did not stop. This was his right. Under Compact procedural law, a co-signatory filing read in open session cannot be interrupted during the reading. The Grand Convener knew this. He had written several of the procedural standards that confirmed it. His interruption flag stayed raised for 4 seconds. Then he lowered it. His dorsal ridge, which had been at full brightness when the session opened, was now dimmer by perhaps 30%. I wrote, bioluminescent ridge output reduced, approximately 30%, timestamp 11/31. I had been documenting that ridge for 9 years. I had never once recorded a reduction in session. Vassal finished the co-signatory list. 9 names. 9 formal titles. The last name he read was Vorincel Andrath, elder of the Velhari archivist caste, and he gave her full 300-year title as it appeared in the Compact's founding record. A title that no session clerk had read aloud in active proceedings in 67 years, because the Velhari archivist caste had been classified as observers, not parties, and observers do not have titles read into the record. Vorincel Andrath stood up. I stopped writing. Not paused, stopped. My stylus did not move. I did not recount my previous sentence silently. I did not do anything for approximately 4 seconds, which I know because I checked the session timestamp later and found a 4-second gap in my notation record. I had been documenting sessions for 28 years. There had never been a gap. I had never seen a Velhari elder stand during an active session. The neutral witness literature, which I had contributed to for 22 of those 28 years, contains no entry for it because it had never happened. The Velhari observer position is seated by institutional protocol. Standing is not prohibited. It has simply never occurred because Velhari observers are not parties to proceedings and therefore have no standing reason to stand. Vorincel Andrath was not standing as an observer. Her name had just been read into the record as a co-signatory. Her status in the room had changed. The protocol had not caught up. The Grand Convener's dorsal ridge dimmed to 60%. His 4 mandibles locked. I had read descriptions of this in the Dominion biological literature. The mandible lock was a processing response, the body's way of managing contested data intake when the volume exceeded normal parameters. I had never seen it in session. In 44 years of Grand Convener service, Uvrath Kel Dasson had never encountered data he could not process in real time. He was encountering it now. The ridge dimmed, then dimmed again, then went still. I wrote, mandibles locked, ridge at approximately 60% output, timestamp 11:34. I noted that I was not sure what classification category this entry belonged to. I left it open. Nessa Call did not stand. Her platform was 2.3 meters below the floor, and she spoke from exactly where she had been placed. She did not raise her voice. She did not adjust her posture. Both hands were still flat on the table, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quality it always had in session, precise and unhurried, as if there were no particular reason to speak faster or slower than the rate at which the words were true. She said, "The record is complete. 61 delegations have read it. We are ready for the vote." 3 sentences, that was all. The Grand Convener did not speak. Under compact procedural law, when a co-signatory filing is presented in open session and the filing party requests a vote, the session chair is required to call the vote. The Grand Convener was the session chair. He was also a voting party to a contested proceeding, which meant he was recused from announcing the count. This provision was in the founding statutes. It had never been relevant before, because no filing with enough co-signatory weight to force a count had ever made it to an open session vote. The Dominion had written the recusal provision too. They had written everything. They had simply never modeled a scenario in which it would be used against them. The Grand Convener called the vote. He did it in 4 words, the minimum the procedure required, in the flat measured voice he used as a dominant signal. The signal was still there. The dominance was not. These are not the same thing, and I noted the difference. The vote opened. It took 4 minutes. Before I tell you the count, I want to note something. Those 4 minutes were the quietest I have ever sat through in 28 years of session work. Not quiet as in no sound, the ventilation ran. Someone in the Dominion gallery shifted in their seat. The session systems produced their normal soft tones. Quiet as in, no one was pretending. For 4 minutes, in a chamber that had been built, specification by specification, to make certain kinds of outcomes feel impossible, nobody was pretending that the outcome was already known. The neutral tallier announced the count, 61 to 44. Declaration 7 Omega, all provisions, all enforcement timelines, all platform adjustment authorizations was nullified. In full, the session record would reflect that the nullification was procedurally clean. The Dominion had voted no, had been counted, and had lost. There was no mechanism to challenge a counted vote in open session. The founding statutes said so. The Dominion had written the founding statutes. The Dominion's own counterfilings, all 2,848 of them, each one confirming in official compact language that the violations they had attempted to dismiss were real, were now part of the permanent record as evidence, filed under the Dominion's own reference numbers, cross-indexed against the Dominion's own session archives. They could not be withdrawn. There was no provision for withdrawal of official counterfilings already entered into the permanent record. There was no provision for this because the Dominion had never needed one. In 440 years of compact majority, they had never been in a position where their own paperwork was the instrument of their loss. That was the mistake. Not any single decision, not any particular session, not any one dismissal among 2,847. The mistake was the assumption that had run underneath all of it, quiet and unchecked for 3 decades, that accumulated objection records from dismissed parties carry no weight, because dismissed parties do not survive long enough to make them matter. The assumption had been wrong. It had been wrong for 31 years, and the Dominion had never audited it. I wrote the erasure was witnessed. I was here. Then I stopped. I looked at what I had written. In 28 years of notation work, I had never written a first-person observation in a session record. The format did not allow for it. The format called for third-party notation in the passive construction, which was the format I had used for 6,000 entries. I had just written 2 sentences in the first person, in active voice, stating a personal presence. I looked at them for a moment. I did not delete them. I added one more line. I do not know how to classify this session. I have decided that is acceptable. I have never written that sentence before. I want the record to show that too. The chamber was still. The Grand Convener had not moved from his seat. His platform had not moved. His ridge had not relit. No Dominion member was speaking. No Dominion member was adjusting their materials or conferring with adjacent delegates or doing any of the things that losing parties usually do in the immediate post-vote interval. They sat in the room they had built and watched the session record close around a result they had not prepared for, because they had believed for 30 years that preparation was not necessary. The Dominion did not fall. It did not flee. It sat in the room it had built and watched its own record used against it. It still exists. Its procedural architecture still exists. What is gone is the load-bearing assumption underneath that architecture, the one that held up everything else. I do not know what it looks like when an institution loses a foundational assumption, but keeps all the structures built on top of it. I have not seen it before. I made a notation entry for it and left the classification field blank. That was the moment I realized I was going to write this account, not a session notation. An account. The difference is that a notation summarizes, an account explains. I had never written an account before. I was not certain I knew how. But I had watched 31 years of work close in 4 minutes and 61 votes, and the people who had built those 31 years were not all in the room to see it, and some of them were not anywhere anymore, and the session record was not going to hold what that meant. Something would have to. Nessa Call requested a procedural extension. 5 minutes filed at the standard administrative close interval. The session clerk granted it by default, which is the procedure when no party objects and the chamber is in administrative wind down. No party objected. The Grand Convener did not object. His ridge was still dim. He did not move. She did not use the 5 minutes. She used 41. She stood at the delegation table, 2.3 meters below the floor level of a chamber that had been designed to keep her there, and she read from a printed list. The list had 183 names on it. She read them in the order they had joined the operation, which meant she began with Aaron Voss, who had started the filing system and not lived to see the 300th entry, and ended with a cartographer named dismantled, who had spent 16 years filing boundary survey data that funded the operation's cover registration without ever knowing that was what the work was for. Dismantled had died 4 years ago. She had never known what the room in Lagos was actually doing. Diplomats, scientists, 3 cartographers, 2 of them like dismantled, people whose legitimate work had been used as cover, who had never been told, who had gone on doing their jobs until they couldn't. 7 people who had worked directly inside the continuance office and had never been allowed to tell anyone. 22 who had worked adjacent roles, feeding data into the system without knowing what the system was. A translator who had spent 11 years turning Velhari archival notation into formats the Lagos filing system could accept, and who had thought she was working on a cultural preservation project. The reading took 41 minutes. No one interrupted. That was the first time in session history that a Terran procedural reading had run its full length without an interruption. The compact does not track this statistic. I know it because I track it, and I had been tracking it for 28 years, and in 28 years it had never happened before. I wrote it into my notation record and then looked at it for a while. Some numbers do not feel like numbers when you first write them down. They feel like something else. I am a Velhari archivist. I do not usually have this problem. Drell Ondas turned the photograph face up. He did it slowly, with 2 fingers on the corner, tilting it up and then setting it back down flat with the image visible. He did not look at it right away. He looked at the table surface next to it for a while. Then he looked at it. His daughter was 37 years old and still did not know what her father did for work, and I do not know what her face looked like in that photograph. But I know that Drell Ondas had not looked at it in a session room for 31 years, and he was looking at it now, and he did not speak. Sova Fenrath took the maintenance requisition form off the data slate and folded it in half, lengthwise, with the careful crease of someone who had handled the same document many times and knew exactly where the paper wanted to fold. She put it in her coat pocket. She had never submitted the form. She did not intend to start. It was not that kind of document. It had never been that kind of document. She had known that from the beginning, and she put it in her pocket the way you put something away when it has done what it was for. Yeth Andrew closed the agricultural output report. The print date on the front was 4 years ago. She had carried it into sessions for 4 years without reading a single entry, her hands needing something to hold, and now the session was over and she folded the page and held it anyway. She kept the last one. I noticed this. I did not know what to write about it, so I wrote, held. Ren Caldas hummed 4 bars of something, the same something she had been humming for longer than I had known her, and then she hummed a 5th bar. I had never heard a 5th bar before. None of them had. She stopped. The piece sounded finished, in a way it had not sounded before. I think it was always going to have a 5th bar. I think she had just been waiting until she knew what it was. Bren Vassal closed the notebook. He set it on the table with both hands, like you set something down that is full. The spine crack was visible from where I was sitting in the gallery. The cardboard cover, worn soft at the corners from 31 years of handling in the same way. He did not open a second one. There was no second one to open. There had only ever been one notebook, and it was full, and he closed it, and that was the end of that. The Dominion remained in the chamber. No member left before the administrative close. No member spoke. The Grand Convener's ridge stayed dim. I watched them for the full interval. They did not confer. They did not adjust their materials. They sat in their seats in the room they had built, and the room was exactly the same as it had always been, and something inside it had changed entirely, and I think they could feel the difference even if they could not name it yet. I could not name it either. I wrote, the assumption is gone. The structure remains. I filed it under no current classification category. I will create a new one. Nessa finished reading the 183 names. She folded the list once and set it on the table. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the tide counter. She held it for a moment in her left hand, the brass frame against her palm, the worn knob under her thumb. The wheel read 2,848. It had read 2,848 since that morning, when she had turned it once without looking. She had not touched the knob since. She set it on the session table. Not in front of her materials, not displayed. She set it at the edge of the table in the space between her place and the empty space beside it, the way you set something down when it belongs somewhere and you have decided this is the place. Not as evidence, not as symbol, because it was finished, and finished things deserve to be put somewhere they can be still. I watched her do this. I noted it. I did not know what classification to give it either. I left the field blank again. I was collecting blank fields today. Maybe that was the record. Maybe the blank fields were the record. The session closed at the standard administrative interval. The chamber lights moved toward standby. Delegations began to gather their materials. The Dominion members rose from their seats in a group, the way they always did, and filed out through the Dominion delegate corridor, the way they always did, and the chamber did not mark their departure in any way. Because the chamber never did, because it was a room, and rooms do not notice what leaves them. I stayed in the gallery until everyone else had gone. I opened my notation folio to the summary page. In 28 years, I had written a summary for every session, 2 sentences minimum, 5 sentences maximum, covering the primary procedural action, the outcome, and any notable variance from standard session behavior. 6,000 summaries. I knew the format the way I knew my own handwriting. I wrote the session number. I wrote the date. I wrote the vote count, 61 to 44. Then I stopped. I sat for a while with the folio open to that page. The summary lines were blank below the count. They stayed blank. I thought about what I would write in them, and I could not find the sentences. Not because nothing had happened, because everything that had happened was already in the record, in the account I had been building since the morning, and putting it smaller did not seem right. The account was the summary. The blank lines already knew that. I closed the folio. She left the tide counter on the table. The wheel read 2,848. She had not touched the increment knob since morning. She did not need to.